The reflection in the cold marble was a stranger's, a woman flushed with a secret fever. Isabella stared, not at her own eyes, but at the faint, angry pink mark blooming just below her jawline, a ghost of a mouth, a brand of a sin so recent she could still taste it on her tongue. The air in the cavernous bathroom was thick with the steam from her shower, but it couldn't wash away the scent that clung to her skin, a masculine, earthy fragrance of sweat and soap, a scent that did not belong to her husband. It was his, Liam's. Her breath hitched, a phantom echo of the breathless moans she had stifled into a pillow just an hour before. A dangerous cocktail of shame and pure, unadulterated pleasure coursed through her veins, a warmth spreading from the pit of her stomach, making her feel more alive than she had in years. It was a terrifying, addictive high. This life, this gilded cage on the 57th floor overlooking Central Park, was supposed to be a dream. It was a world of seamless luxury, of charity galas where her smile was as meticulously curated as her diamond earrings, of silent dinners where the clinking of silverware was the only conversation with her husband, Richard. He didn't see her. He saw a beautiful asset, a testament to his success, another perfect object in his collection. He was a man of grand gestures and empty words, a husband present only in title. And then, Liam had arrived. After a minor security scare that Richard had deemed an inconvenience, Liam was hired. He wasn't like the others, the burly men who looked at her with a mixture of deference and poorly concealed lust. Liam's gaze was different. It was calm, observant, and unnervingly perceptive. He didn't just look at her. He seemed to see right through the expensive facade to the loneliness shivering beneath. In his professional silence, she felt an acknowledgement, a quiet understanding that was more intimate than any touch Richard had given her in years. He was just a shadow, assigned to guard her body. But from the very first day, Isabella knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the real danger was the threat he posed to her soul. He was the keeper of her safety and the architect of her fall. The days bled into one another, each a perfect, sterile copy of the last. Isabella's world, from the 57th floor, was a silent film playing out in exquisite, painstaking detail. Her mornings began not with the warmth of a shared bed, but with the cold expanse of fine Egyptian cotton sheets beside her, undisturbed. Richard was always gone before the sun had fully illuminated the city, his presence marked only by a hastily discarded tie on a valet stand or the lingering scent of his expensive, sharp cologne, a scent that always felt more like a brand than an intimacy. Breakfast was a solitary affair, a single-place setting at a vast marble table designed for 12. The city hummed below her, a vibrant, living thing, but up here, in the climate-controlled silence of the penthouse, the only sound was the soft scrape of her silver spoon against porcelain. She was a ghost in her own home, a curator of a museum dedicated to a life she was supposed to be living. She would drift through the rooms, her hand trailing over the cool, impersonal surfaces of abstract sculptures and modern art that Richard had acquired at auctions. They were investments, he'd said, just like everything else. She felt like an investment herself, one that was meant to be admired but never touched with genuine, uncalculated affection. Liam was a part of this landscape now, a new, solid feature in her ethereal existence. He was a shadow in a perfectly tailored suit, a presence so quiet and unobtrusive that sometimes she would forget he was there, until she would catch a glimpse of his reflection in a darkened window or a polished surface. He never intruded. He simply existed, a bastion of calm, steady watchfulness. He would stand by the door, his posture relaxed but alert, his gaze sweeping the surroundings with a practiced economy of movement. He spoke only when necessary, his voice a low, steady baritone that never betrayed an ounce of emotion. "The car is ready, Mrs. Sterling. This way, if you please." His professionalism was absolute, a wall of impeccable etiquette. Yet it was in his silence that he communicated the most. He was the only person in the world who saw the truth of her days. He saw the hours she spent staring out the window, the way her shoulders would slump the moment the elevator doors closed, leaving her alone in the hallway. He saw the book she would start and abandon, the flicker of disappointment in her eyes, when a call from Richard was, as always, about logistics, about a schedule change, never about her. One evening, Richard was actually home for dinner, a rare occasion that felt more like a performance review than a shared meal. He sat at the opposite end of the long table, his phone glowing beside his plate, a third party in their marriage. She tried to tell him about a small gallery she had visited that afternoon, a place filled with the vibrant, chaotic work of emerging artists. She spoke of a particular painting, a canvas of deep blues and violent slashes of red that had moved her. Richard nodded, his eyes still on his screen, a dismissive, "That's nice, darling," falling from his lips before he interrupted her. "Eleanor and I closed the Kensington deal today. A 9-figure acquisition. We should celebrate this weekend. I'll have my assistant arrange something." He hadn't heard a word she'd said. The blue and red of the painting felt like her own heart, bruised and bleeding. She felt a familiar, cold wave of invisibility wash over her. She looked up, past her husband's self-satisfied smile, and her eyes inadvertently met Liam's. He was standing at his post by the dining room entrance, impassive as ever. But for a fraction of a second, his gaze held hers, and in the depths of his dark eyes, she saw not pity, but a flicker of something else. Understanding, he had seen it all. He had heard the passion in her voice, and he had witnessed the casual cruelty of its dismissal. In that fleeting moment, she felt less alone. The seed that was planted that evening was watered a few days later. She was leaving a boutique on Madison Avenue, her mind elsewhere, replaying another sterile phone call with Richard. The city was a blur of noise and motion. Dressed in heels that were beautiful but treacherous on the uneven pavement, she misjudged a curb, her ankle twisting awkwardly. Time seemed to slow down. She felt that sickening lurch of losing her balance, the ground rushing up to meet her in a humiliating sprawl. But it never came. In a movement so swift and fluid it was almost imperceptible, Liam was there. One strong arm wrapped around her waist, his grip firm and impersonal, while his other hand steadied her arm. He pulled her back from the brink, holding her upright against the solid wall of his chest. For 3 heartbeats, the world stopped. The cacophony of the city faded into a dull roar. All Isabella could feel was him, the solid, unyielding strength of his body, the surprising heat of his hand through the thin silk of her blouse, a warmth that seemed to seep directly into her skin. She could smell the clean, subtle scent of his laundry detergent mixed with that faint, personal musk she was beginning to recognize. It was a scent of pure reality, a stark contrast to the synthetic perfection of her husband's world. His touch was not gentle or suggestive. It was functional, a simple act of preventing a fall. But for a woman starved of genuine human contact, it was a revelation. It was the touch of a man, solid and real, a touch that asked for nothing and expected nothing, a touch that was simply there to keep her from harm. It was the most profound physical connection she had experienced in a decade. She looked up, her face just inches from his. His jaw was set, his dark eyes scanning her face, not with alarm, but with a focused concern. "Are you all right, Mrs. Sterling?" he asked, his voice the same low, steady baritone, yet it felt different now, vibrating through the points of contact between their bodies. The professional mask was still there, but his eyes held hers for a second too long. In that shared gaze, something shifted. A barrier cracked. She saw a flicker of the man behind the guard, a deep, quiet current of something she couldn't name. It was gone as quickly as it came. He released her, stepping back to a respectful distance, his posture once again neutral, professional. "I'm fine," she managed to breathe, her voice unsteady. "Thank you, Liam." She was fine, but as she walked the short distance to the waiting car, her body was thrumming with a strange new energy. Her skin tingled where he had touched her. She was acutely aware of him walking behind her, a silent, watchful presence who had, in the space of 3 seconds, become something more than just a bodyguard. He had become a possibility, a dangerous, intoxicating possibility in the gilded emptiness of her cage. The fall, as she came to call it in the privacy of her own mind, had rewired the very atmosphere between them. The air in the car, in the elevator, in the vast, silent rooms of the penthouse, was now charged with a low humming current of unspoken awareness. It was a slow burn, a gradual heating of the space between them that was both terrifying and exquisitely thrilling. Professionalism was still the language they spoke, but a new, more dangerous dialect was being written in the silences, in the glances that lasted a heartbeat too long. She would catch him looking at her in the reflection of a shop window, his expression unreadable but intense, and he would turn away a fraction of a second after their eyes met. She, in turn, found her own gaze drawn to him, tracing the sharp line of his jaw when he was focused on scanning a crowd, or watching the way his powerful shoulders moved beneath the fine wool of his suit as he opened a door for her. He was a constant, solid presence, and she was becoming addicted to the quiet gravity of him. Her senses, dulled by years of sterile perfection, had reawakened and centered on him entirely. In the confined space of the elevator, she could discern the faint, clean scent of him, a scent she now craved, and she found herself holding her breath, trying to memorize it. The sound of his steady footsteps on the marble floor behind her became a comforting rhythm, a counterpoint to the anxious beating of her own heart. The accidental touches became a form of secret torture. When he passed her a shopping bag, his fingers would brush against hers, a brief, electric shock that would leave her skin tingling for minutes afterward. Once, while navigating a crowded restaurant, he placed a hand on the small of her back to guide her. The gesture was brief, correct, and entirely professional, but the firm, warm pressure of his palm felt like a brand. She could feel its ghost for the rest of the evening, a secret heat that belonged only to her. She started to live for these fleeting, charged moments, tiny sparks in the monotonous gray of her existence. A subtle shift occurred within her. The passive loneliness that had defined her for years began to curdle into a more active, restless longing. She was no longer content to simply exist in her cage. She began to test its bars, not for escape, but to bring him closer. Her schedule, once a predictable rotation of lunches, charity boards, and spa appointments, began to include strange new detours. She feigned a sudden interest in obscure history, requesting a trip to a dusty, forgotten corner of the Metropolitan Museum on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. There, surrounded by ancient artifacts, the formal barrier between them felt thinner. "Richard thinks these are just old rocks," she said quietly, gesturing to a display of Sumerian tablets. "He doesn't see the stories." She glanced at Liam, who was standing a respectful distance away. "Do you see the stories, Liam?" He was taken aback, his professional composure faltering for a moment. He looked at the tablets, then back at her. "I see what they survived," he answered, his voice low. "Wars, empires rising and falling. They're still here. There's a story in that." His answer was simple, yet it held a depth that resonated with her own sense of being a relic in a life that wasn't hers. It was the first time they had a conversation that wasn't about logistics or security. It was a tiny, fragile bridge built between two isolated worlds. She grew bolder. She asked him to take her to a sprawling, chaotic bookstore in the village, a place Richard would have despised. She wandered through the narrow aisles, pulling down heavy volumes, pretending to read the jackets. What she was really doing was creating a smaller, more intimate space for them to exist in. She was acutely aware of him moving through the stacks behind her, a silent guardian in a temple of words. She turned, a book of poetry in her hand. "Do you read, Liam?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. He hesitated, his eyes flicking from the book to her face. "When I have the time," he admitted. "What kind of things?" She pressed gently. A flicker of something crossed his face, a hint of a life lived before this one. "History, mostly," he said. "Thucydides?" "The classics." The answer surprised her. It hinted at a disciplined, thoughtful mind, a stark contrast to the brute force she might have once associated with his profession. This was a man of substance, a man of hidden depths, and the knowledge of it was like pouring gasoline on the slow-burning fire inside her. Her fascination with him became a quiet obsession. She studied him the way she had once studied art history in college. She learned the rhythm of his breathing, the way a muscle in his jaw would tighten when he was particularly alert. She noticed the small, almost invisible scar that cut through his left eyebrow, and wondered about the story it held. She became an expert on his hands, They were large, capable hands with clean, short-nailed fingers. She had felt their strength when he'd caught her, and now she found herself imagining what that strength would feel like in other contexts. She pictured those hands tangled in her hair, gripping her hips, tracing the curve of her spine. The thoughts were dangerous, forbidden, and they filled her with a dizzying mix of shame and longing. This was no longer just a physical awareness. It was a deep, consuming curiosity about the man himself. Who was Liam when he took off the suit? Who was he when he wasn't standing guard over another man's wife? The questions haunted her, following her into her cold, empty bed at night, where she would lie awake, the ghost of his touch on her back, her mind replaying his surprising words about ancient history, and her body aching with a need so profound it felt like a sickness. The burn was no longer slow. It was beginning to build into a hungry, roaring flame. The breaking point came on a Thursday, disguised as a dinner party. Richard loved to entertain, to hold court in their sprawling penthouse, transforming their home into a stage for his success. Tonight, the audience consisted of a rival CEO, his vapid wife, and a smarmy hedge fund manager. Isabella played her part, as she always did, a vision in deep blue silk, her smile a perfect, polished mask. Liam was a statue in the corner of the room, his presence a dark, solid anchor in a sea of glittering champagne flutes and hollow laughter. The conversation turned to art, a topic on which Isabella was genuinely knowledgeable. She offered a thoughtful opinion on a new exhibition at the MoMA, her voice quiet but confident. Before she could finish her sentence, Richard let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Darling, please," he said, waving a hand as if shooing away a fly. "Leave the analysis to the critics. Your job is just to look beautiful next to it." He turned to the hedge fund manager, a conspiratorial wink in his eye. "She's my best acquisition, but her portfolio insights are a little sentimental." The words, though coated in the veneer of a joke, were tiny, poisoned darts. In front of their guests, he had reduced her to a pretty object, stripping her of her intellect and her voice with a casual, smiling cruelty. The hedge fund manager snickered. The rival CEO's wife gave her a look of thin, pitying sympathy that was somehow worse than the insult itself. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face, a cold, sickening shame washing over her. She held her smile in place, a feat of sheer willpower, feeling the brittle facade of her composure begin to crack. Her eyes, as if by instinct, flickered towards the corner of the room. Liam was looking directly at her. His face was impassive, a mask of professional neutrality, but in his eyes, she saw a flash of something hard and dark, a brief, violent storm of anger on her behalf. He had seen, he had understood. The shared, silent acknowledgement was the only thing that kept her from shattering right there at the dinner table. Somehow, she endured the rest of the evening. She smiled, she nodded, she laughed at jokes she didn't hear. But inside, she was screaming. The moment the last guest departed, the silence they left behind was deafening. Richard, humming to himself, poured a final glass of scotch and retreated to his study without a word to her, completely oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the wound he had inflicted. The silence screamed his neglect. She stood alone in the grand living room, the city lights twinkling below like a million unfeeling eyes. She felt a tremor start in her hands, a deep, shuddering cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had to get out. "Liam," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "take me for a drive." He simply nodded, his professionalism a strange comfort in her turmoil. The ride down in the elevator was a study in unbearable tension. She stood trembling, hugging herself, while he stood stoically, his gaze fixed on the glowing numbers as they descended. He didn't speak, but his presence filled the small space, a silent, powerful witness to her unraveling. In the back of the Maybach, as it slid silently through the deserted late-night streets of Manhattan, the dam finally broke. A single, hot tear escaped, then another, and soon she was crying in complete silence, the city lights blurring into long, sorrowful streaks of neon through the tinted window. He must have seen her in the rearview mirror. After several blocks of her silent weeping, he broke his own rigid code. A small, dark box was passed from the front seat to the back. a box of tissues. Then his voice, low and careful, reached her. "Are you all right, Mrs. Sterling?" It wasn't an intrusion, it was an offering. A simple, human question that no one had thought to ask her all night. The kindness in it, the sheer, unexpected grace of it, undid her completely. The silent tears turned into a quiet, choked sob. He didn't say another word. He just drove. He took a long, circuitous route through darkened streets and along the river, giving her the gift of time and anonymity to cry. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, he turned the car back towards home. He pulled into the subterranean garage, the engine dying with a soft sigh, plunging them into a heavy, resonant silence. The only light came from the cold, fluorescent tubes overhead, casting long shadows. It was over. She was back in the cage. She should get out, go upstairs, and pretend this night never happened. But she couldn't move. She couldn't go back to the emptiness waiting for her upstairs. Not yet. In that moment, surrounded by concrete and steel, Liam was the only real thing in her world. He was the only one who had seen her pain. Acting on an impulse born of pure desperation, of a profound and aching need to be seen, to be held, to feel something other than hollow, she leaned forward, across the cool leather seats. "Liam," she whispered, her voice raw. He turned in his seat, his face half lit by the garage lights. "Mrs. Sterling." And then she closed the distance. She surged forward, her hand landing on his shoulder to steady herself, and pressed her mouth to his. It was a kiss of pure, unadulterated despair. It was clumsy and frantic, fueled by champagne and sorrow. It tasted of salt from her tears and the expensive, bitter lipstick she wore. It was not a kiss of seduction. It was a primal scream made of flesh and breath, a desperate attempt to feel a connection, any connection, to another human being. For a long, frozen second, he was completely still, rigid with shock. She could feel the conflict warring within him, the rigid discipline fighting against a more elemental force. She felt his body tense as if to pull away, and her heart sank. But then, something broke in him too. A low groan rumbled in his chest, a sound of surrender. His hand came up, not to push her away, but to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her carefully styled hair, and he kissed her back. The shock of his response was a lightning bolt through her system. His kiss wasn't gentle. It mirrored her own desperation, but it was layered with a fierce, suppressed hunger that stunned her. It was a kiss that spoke of lonely nights, of disciplined desire, of watching her from afar for weeks. All the unspoken tension, all the lingering glances and accidental touches exploded in that single, desperate moment. They broke apart, gasping for air, their faces inches apart. The silence of the garage rushed back in, now thick and heavy with the irrevocable thing they had just done. The line had not just been crossed, it had been annihilated. The days that followed the kiss were an exercise in exquisite torment. The air between them, once charged with a slow-burning tension, was now thick with the radioactive fallout of their transgression. They moved through their routines in a state of strained, silent formality, the unspoken memory of the garage hanging between them like a physical presence. They studiously avoided each other's eyes. When he held a door open, she would murmur, "Thank you," to the floor. When he passed her the morning paper, their fingers would recoil from the potential of contact as if from a naked flame. The silence was no longer professional. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from guilt, desire, and profound, terrifying uncertainty. Every mundane interaction was now a high-wire act, performed over a chasm of unspoken questions. What are we? What happens now? The universe, in its infinite and cruel wisdom, answered for them. Richard announced he was flying to Shanghai for a 4-day trip, a last-minute emergency with a new acquisition. He packed with his usual self-important flurry, barking orders into his phone, and left in a whirlwind of expensive cologne and dismissive farewells. The moment the heavy penthouse door clicked shut behind him, the silence that descended was different. It was not the familiar silence of loneliness. It was the vast, echoing silence of possibility. The cage was empty, save for the canary and the keeper. The sheer size of the apartment, usually a source of isolation for Isabella, now felt like a character in their drama, a vast, empty stage waiting for the play to begin. The first 24 hours were a masterclass in avoidance. They were two planets locked in a dangerous orbit, acutely aware of each other's presence in the sprawling space. She took her meals in the breakfast nook. He remained stationed in the foyer. She sequestered herself in the library. He made a point of surveying the opposite end of the apartment. Yet his presence was a constant thrum beneath the surface of her consciousness. She heard the soft, solid tread of his shoes in the hallway, and her heart would leap. She caught his scent lingering in the elevator long after he'd been there, and she would close her eyes and breathe it in. Sleep offered no escape. She tossed and turned in the vast, empty bed, the cool sheets a tormenting reminder of her solitude. The memory of his mouth on hers, desperate and demanding, played on a loop in her mind, a ghost of a sensation that made her body ache with a deep, unfamiliar longing. On the second night, the pretense shattered. The restlessness was a fever in her blood, an impossible itch beneath her skin. Sleep was a distant country she could not reach. Giving up, she slid out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floor. She pulled on a simple slip of a nightgown, a sheath of dark blue silk that felt like a second skin. She didn't have a plan. She was simply drawn, as if by an invisible thread, out of the lonely darkness of her bedroom and into the main living area. And there he was. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a dark silhouette against the glittering tapestry of the city lights. He was on duty, ever watchful, but there was a stillness about him, a pensiveness in his posture that told her he was not just guarding the perimeter, he was wrestling with his own ghosts. He must have sensed her, or perhaps heard the whisper of silk against her skin. He turned slowly, and their eyes met across the cavernous, moonlit room. And that was it. The dance was over. The questions, the guilt, the fear, it all dissolved in that one long, searching look. There was no need for words. In his eyes, she saw her own desperate longing reflected back at her, a raw, undisguised hunger that mirrored the ache in her own soul. He took a single, deliberate step towards her, then another. He crossed the expanse of the room with the same silent, predatory grace she'd come to know, but this time, he was not her protector. He was a man, coming for a woman who was waiting for him. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He raised a hand, slowly, as if not to spook a wild animal, and his fingers gently traced the line of her jaw, his thumbs stroking the exact spot where she had imagined his phantom kiss. A shudder racked her body. He leaned in, and his first kiss was nothing like the frantic collision in the garage. It was slow, deep, and deliberate, a kiss of confirmation, a sealing of their silent pact. It was a kiss that tasted of sleepless nights and forbidden daydreams. With a low groan, she melted into him, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders. He broke the kiss, his breathing ragged, and in one fluid motion, he swept her into his arms. He didn't carry her to the bedroom. Instead, he laid her down on the priceless Persian rug in the center of the living room, in the heart of the home that was her prison, claiming the space as their own. Kneeling over her, he took the thin straps of her nightgown and slowly, deliberately, drew the silk up and over her head, letting it pool on the floor beside them. She was left in nothing but a whisper of black lace lingerie, her skin glowing pale in the moonlight. Her heart hammered against her ribs as his dark, hungry eyes drank her in. He began to unbutton his own shirt, his movements economical and precise, revealing a chest and shoulders honed by years of discipline. It was the first time she had seen him, truly seen him, and he was more beautiful and dangerous than she had ever imagined. When his bare skin finally touched hers, it was an explosion. A gasp escaped her lips as the heat of his chest met the cool, waiting skin of her stomach. This was not the tender exploration of lovers. It was a desperate, frantic collision of two starved people. It was clumsy and urgent, a tangle of limbs and hungry mouths. His hands were everywhere, learning the curves of her waist, the swell of her hips, the softness of her thighs. Her own hands explored the hard planes of his back, the surprising texture of the scars she found there, Clothes were discarded with a reckless urgency. The sounds that filled the silent room were the sounds of pure, unbridled lust, the harsh rasp of their breathing, the soft, wet sounds of mouths exploring, and the rhythmic, slapping sound of skin against skin as he finally pushed into her. She cried out, a sound that was half pain, half pleasure, arching her back to take him deeper. It was a raw, primal claiming, a desperate act of connection that blotted out the entire world. There was no Richard, no 57th floor, no tomorrow. There was only this, only him, only the two of them, moving together on the floor of the gilded cage, finally, terrifyingly, free. The frantic, desperate hunger of their first encounter had broken the dam. Now, in its wake, flowed a slower, deeper current. The next evening, after a day spent in a haze of shared glances and secret smiles, the question was not if, but when. There was a new confidence between them, a silent understanding that had replaced the frantic uncertainty. As twilight painted the city in shades of bruised purple and soft gray, Isabella walked into her bedroom and found him waiting for her, standing by the window. This time, there was no hesitation. She went to him, rising on her toes to press a soft, certain kiss to his lips. Tonight was not about desperation. It was about discovery. With a silent accord, she took his hand and led him to the vast, king-sized bed, the very heart of her gilded cage, the space she was forced to share with Richard. To bring Liam here was the ultimate transgression, a reclamation of her own pleasure in the place that defined her marital duty. It was a silent, profound rebellion. This time, the moonlight was their accomplice. It spilled through the windows, bathing the room in a soft, ethereal glow, rendering their bodies in silver and shadow. There was no rush, only a slow, deliberate unwrapping of layers, both physical and emotional. He undressed her with an almost reverent patience, his calloused fingertips a delicious friction against her soft skin. He unhooked her bra, letting it fall away, and his breath hitched as he looked at her. In Richard's presence, she often felt like a mannequin, her body, an object to be maintained. But under Liam's gaze, she felt worshipped. He didn't just look, he saw. He saw the faint tracery of veins beneath the pale skin of her breasts, the gentle curve of her stomach, the flare of her hips. His eyes mapped her body with an intensity that made her flush from head to toe. She, in turn, was just as captivated. As he shed his own clothes, she saw the man stripped of his uniform, his armor. His body was a landscape of contradictions, hard muscle, and surprising tenderness, the disciplined physique of a soldier overlaid with a quiet grace. Her fingers, tentative at first, then bolder, began their own exploration. She traced the taut lines of his shoulders and the powerful muscles of his arms. Her journey led her to his back, to the network of faint, silvery scars that marred the otherwise perfect skin. She traced the largest one, a jagged line near his shoulder blade, her touch a silent question. He flinched, almost imperceptibly, and she felt a pang of connection to a past he never spoke of, a history of pain written on his skin. She leaned forward and pressed a soft, healing kiss to the scar, an act of acceptance that made him shudder beneath her touch. He laid her back against the cool, expensive sheets and began his own worship. He started with her hair, burying his face in the dark silk, inhaling her scent as if it were oxygen. His lips trailed from her temple, down the sensitive column of her neck, to the hollow of her collarbone. He kissed her shoulders, his mouth warm and firm. She watched him, mesmerized, as he paid homage to her breasts. He admired the way they swelled, full and heavy, under his gaze, the way they rose and fell with her quickening breath. He circled a nipple with his tongue, and a soft, involuntary gasp escaped her lips. The sound, her own sound of pleasure, was a revelation. It was a sound Richard had never heard. Liam licked and suckled with a patient, maddening skill, sending jolts of lightning straight to her core, and her soft gasps began to build into low, guttural moans. His hands were instruments of discovery. They swept down her sides, learning the dip of her slender waist, his thumbs pressing gently into the soft flesh there before continuing their journey south. He cupped her buttocks, his large hands spanning their full, round curves, kneading them gently, lifting her slightly against him. The friction was intoxicating. He was learning the anatomy of her desire, and she was an eager subject. His exploration continued, his mouth and hands moving lower, discovering the intimate heat of her. The quiet, hesitant moans she had made before now gave way to something deeper, less controlled. As his fingers delved into her wetness, a sharp, keening cry broke from her lips. The sound was shocking in the quiet room, a raw, unfiltered expression of the pleasure he was building within her. The wet, slick sounds of his exploration, of her own body's eager response, filled the air, a secret, intimate music that belonged only to them. When she felt she could bear no more, when her entire being was a tightly coiled spring of need, she pulled him up to her, her eyes pleading. "Liam, please," she breathed. He positioned himself above her, and as he entered her, it was a slow, perfect joining. There was none of the frantic haste of their first time. This was a deep, deliberate connection, a conscious coupling of two bodies that now knew the path to each other's pleasure. He moved within her with a powerful, steady rhythm, his eyes locked on hers. He watched her face, reading every flicker of pleasure, every subtle shift in her expression. He saw the moment her eyes widened, the way her lips parted as the wave began to build. He drove deeper, and she arched her back, her nails digging into the hard muscle of his back, crying out his name as the climax seized her, a shattering, all-consuming release that left her boneless and trembling. Moments later, with a final deep thrust, he followed her, his own body tensing, a guttural groan torn from his throat as he poured his release into her. For a long time, they lay just like that, their bodies still joined, slick with sweat, their hearts hammering in unison against each other's chests. The only sound was their ragged breathing, slowly returning to normal. This was more than sex. In the bed of her absent husband, surrounded by the trappings of a life of lies, she had found a moment of profound, terrifying truth. She wrapped her arms around his neck, holding on tightly, a silent plea for this moment, this feeling of being utterly seen and exquisitely wanted, to never end. The stolen days of Richard's absence melted into a secret, sensual eternity. The vast penthouse, once Isabella's opulent prison, had transformed into their private kingdom, a sanctuary dedicated to the exploration of a desire that grew more audacious with each passing hour. The initial shock of their affair had subsided, replaced by a confident, almost reckless hunger. They were no longer simply falling together in moments of weakness. They were consciously, deliberately choosing to plunge deeper into the intoxicating abyss they had created. The boundaries of their former lives, and of their own inhibitions, began to dissolve in the heat of their shared obsession. They had moved beyond simple connection into the wild, unmapped territory of pure, untamed lust. The exploration began one afternoon, in the cavernous master bathroom, a space of cold marble and gleaming chrome that they decided to claim with steam and skin. As the powerful shower hissed to life, filling the glass enclosure with a thick white fog, Liam drew her inside. The hot water sluicing over their bodies was a shock to the system, washing away the last vestiges of who they were supposed to be, the CEO's wife, the dutiful bodyguard, leaving only a man and a woman, naked and hungry for one another. Here, in the swirling steam, he introduced her to a new level of intimacy, a new language of pleasure. He knelt before her on the slick marble floor, his eyes dark with a worshipful intensity. "Let me," he whispered, his voice a low rumble against the hiss of the water. He parted her legs with a gentle, confident touch and began to worship her with his mouth. For Isabella, this was a revelation. With Richard, sex had been a predictable, goal-oriented act, devoid of this kind of selfless devotion. Liam's tongue was an instrument of exquisite torture, patient and skillful, learning the secrets of her body with a focused dedication that made her dizzy. She braced her hands against the cool, wet glass, her head thrown back, a torrent of new sensations flooding her. She felt a profound vulnerability, a complete surrender that was terrifying and yet unbelievably liberating. The soft, breathy moans she had just learned to release now deepened, catching in her throat as he brought her closer and closer to the edge. He seemed to relish her response, the way her body trembled uncontrollably under his touch, the way her fingers clenched and unclenched on the glass. When the climax finally came, it was not a gentle wave, but a violent, crashing tsunami, a raw, guttural cry tearing from her lips, echoing off the marble walls, a sound of pure, uninhibited release that she had never known she was capable of making. As she slumped against the wall, boneless and breathless, a new feeling rose within her, mingling with the pleasure. It was a feeling of power, a desire to not just receive this incredible gift, but to give it in return. When he rose, his face slick with water and satisfaction, she met his gaze, and he saw the shift in her eyes. With a newfound confidence, she gently pushed him back until he was sitting on the marble bench inside the shower. She knelt before him, taking him into her hands. There was a flicker of hesitation. This was uncharted territory, but the sight of him, strong and vulnerable before her, ignited a fierce, protective desire. She wanted to give him the same all-consuming pleasure he had given her. She took him into her mouth, her initial uncertainty quickly replaced by an intuitive understanding of the rhythm he craved. She learned the texture of him, the taste of him, the low, animalistic groans he made deep in his chest as she moved. The power dynamic had shifted. She was in control, and the realization was intoxicating. To pleasure him, to drive the strong, silent man who had guarded her life to a state of quivering, helpless need, was a heady, empowering thrill. His hands tangled in her wet hair, his hips bucked, and with a harsh cry of his own, he surrendered completely to her. Their lovemaking became a dance of dominance and submission, a fluid exchange of power rooted in absolute trust. They moved from the shower to the bedroom, their wet bodies leaving a trail on the expensive carpets. They explored new positions, each one unlocking a different facet of their desire. He took her from behind, pressing her against the cool glass of the floor-to-ceiling window, the glittering city spread out below them like their own private audience. In this position, it was raw, primal, and deeply carnal. His thrusts were powerful, possessive, and she met his rhythm with a wild abandon. Her hands splayed on the glass, her reflection a pale, ghostly image intertwined with his darker, more powerful form. It was the thrill of the forbidden, the danger of being seen, even by an indifferent city, that pushed them both to a frantic, explosive peak. Later, they would slow down, rediscovering a tender intimacy. She would straddle him, their bodies pressed together, facing one another as they moved in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. This was a different kind of pleasure, more emotional, more connected. She could look into his eyes, watch the love and lust mingling in their dark depths. She could kiss him deeply, her legs wrapped around his waist, their hearts beating a steady matched tempo. It was in these moments that whispers would pass between them, a dialogue of pure desire. "Look at me," he would command in a low voice, and she would obey, her gaze locking with his as he moved within her. "Isabella," he would groan, her name a prayer on his lips, and the sound of it, so full of passion, would be enough to send another shiver of pleasure through her. She, in turn, grew bold. "Deeper," she would whisper, her voice husky, and he would oblige, a satisfied growl rumbling in his chest. This was their secret language, a vocabulary of touch and sound and whispered commands, a shared world of pleasure built on a foundation of broken rules. They were no longer just committing adultery, they were charting the vast, exhilarating landscape of their own sexuality, and in their shared transgressions, they were finding a freedom neither had ever known was possible. The raw, explosive hedonism of their encounters began to leave a new kind of afterglow. In the quiet hours that followed their lovemaking, when their bodies were spent and slick with sweat, a different kind of intimacy began to bloom in the darkness. They would lie entangled in the sheets of her marital bed, the distant city lights painting stripes across the ceiling, and in the comfortable silence, words began to surface. These were not the breathless whispers of passion, but the quiet, hesitant confessions of two lonely souls who had found an unexpected sanctuary in each other's arms. The affair of the body was, almost without their noticing, becoming an affair of the mind. It started with the scars. One night, as she lay with her head on his chest, her fingers tracing the faint, silvery lines on his skin. She asked the question in a voice barely louder than a breath. What happened here? She expected him to deflect, to retreat behind his usual wall of professional silence. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, his hand stroking her hair. Afghanistan, he finally said, his voice low and rough with memory. He didn't offer grand stories of battle or heroism. He spoke of the quiet things, the details that haunt a man. He talked about the suffocating, omnipresent dust that got into everything. He described the specific, unnerving silence that would fall over the mountains just before an attack, a silence that, to this day, he could still hear in a quiet room. He spoke of a friend, a young man named Casey who loved bad jokes and always talked about opening a surf shop in California. He didn't describe how Casey died. He simply spoke of his absence, a sudden, permanent void that had reshaped his world. You learn to watch, he said, his voice distant. You watch everything. People's hands, the way they shift their weight, the look in their eyes. You do it for so long you forget how to stop, you forget how to just be. In his quiet, fragmented story, Isabella understood the source of his stillness, his unnerving perception. It wasn't just a professional skill, it was a scar on his soul, a state of permanent vigilance he could never switch off. His confession was a key, unlocking a door within her. In the safety of his arms, she began to speak of her own buried life, the dreams that had slowly suffocated under the weight of Richard's world. She told him about her university days, about her passion for Renaissance art, about a dream she once had of working as a curator in a small specialist museum in Florence. I wanted to spend my life with beautiful things that had stories, she said, a sad smile touching her lips. Ironic, isn't it? I'm surrounded by beautiful things, but they're all soulless. They're assets, investments. She talked about the slow, insidious process of becoming Mrs. Richard Sterling, how her opinions were gradually replaced by his, her schedule erased to accommodate his, her very identity sanded down until she was just a smooth, polished reflection of his success. Her prison wasn't a war zone of dust and death, but it was a battle of attrition, a slow, quiet death of the self. They were two profoundly different people from two profoundly different worlds. Yet in their shared confessions, they found a startling, resonant symmetry. Both were survivors of a kind, haunted by ghosts, and trapped in roles they hadn't chosen. The physical intimacy that had brought them together was now the catalyst for a much deeper, more dangerous connection. Sex was the language they had learned first, a raw, primal form of communication, but now it was a gateway to something more. Their lovemaking became imbued with this new emotional weight. A kiss was no longer just a kiss, it was an act of comfort. A touch was not just for pleasure, it was an affirmation, a way of saying, I see you, I know you. The most terrifying moment of all came not during a passionate climax, but in a moment of absolute stillness. Liam had fallen asleep, his breathing deep and even, one arm thrown protectively over her waist. The moonlight cast his face in soft relief, smoothing out the hard lines of vigilance, making him look younger, more vulnerable. Isabella lay awake, watching him, her heart aching with a tenderness that was completely new and overwhelming. She studied the curve of his lips, the dark sweep of his eyelashes against his cheek. And as she watched him, a single, devastating word bloomed in the silence of her mind. Love. It wasn't a thought she invited. It arrived unbidden, a quiet, catastrophic truth that settled deep in her bones. The realization was not joyful. It was terrifying. This was no longer a simple, selfish act of rebellion. It was not a physical affair she could compartmentalize, a secret vice she could indulge in and then put away. She was in love with him. This man, this quiet, wounded soldier who worked for her husband, had breached the final, most heavily fortified wall around her heart. The guilt, which had before been a manageable, almost thrilling companion to their lust, now became a monstrous, crushing weight. Every touch, every shared secret, every stolen moment was now a betrayal on an epic scale. She was not just cheating on her husband, she was giving her heart, the one thing he had never asked for or wanted, to another man. She looked at Liam, sleeping peacefully beside her, and felt a surge of fierce, protective love, followed immediately by a cold wave of pure dread. What had she done? This was not a game. This was a love affair, born in a gilded cage, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that there was no way it could ever end in anything but ruins. The love they had cultivated in secret had created a bubble, a fragile, shimmering sphere of intimacy that seemed to float high above the real world. Inside it, they were not the CEO's wife and the bodyguard. They were simply Isabella and Liam, two people who had found each other in the dark. Their stolen time had made them comfortable, lulled them into a false sense of security. The constant, looming threat of Richard had become a distant abstraction, a problem for a future that felt a million years away. They had become careless, intoxicated by their emotional and physical connection, believing their secret world was impenetrable. That bubble was about to be burst with brutal, terrifying finality. It happened on a Tuesday night. A night Richard was supposed to be in Chicago. They had spent the evening in a state of languid bliss, making slow, tender love, and were now lying tangled in the sheets, talking in low murmurs. Isabella was tracing the lines of his chest with her finger, telling him a story from her childhood, her voice soft with contentment. He was listening, his eyes closed, a rare, peaceful smile on his face. The penthouse was silent, save for their whispers and the distant hum of the city. It was a perfect, peaceful moment, a snapshot of the life they fantasized about. And then they heard it, a sound that did not belong. The distinct, metallic chime of the private elevator arriving at the penthouse floor. For a frozen second, they both went utterly still, their bodies rigid. It couldn't be. Housekeeping didn't come at this hour. Staff used the service elevator. Their eyes met across the dim light of the bedroom, and in that shared look, a cold, sickening dread bloomed and consumed everything. There was only one other person who used that elevator. The sound of a key sliding into the lock of the front door was like a gunshot in the silent apartment. Richard. He was home, a day early. The bubble didn't just burst, it vaporized. What followed was a frantic, silent explosion of pure panic. The peaceful lover was gone, and in his place was the soldier, his body coiled with adrenaline and purpose. Liam was out of the bed in a single fluid motion, his mind instantly calculating, assessing, reacting. There was no time for words, only for the desperate, animal instinct of survival. He began pulling on his clothes with a speed and efficiency that was terrifying to watch. The soft whispers of their intimacy were replaced by the harsh rasp of denim being pulled on, the sharp zip of a fly, the frantic rustle of a shirt. Isabella scrambled out of bed, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she thought it might break through. Her mind raced, scanning the room for evidence, for the telltale signs of their love. The two used glasses on the bedside table, his belt, lying like a coiled snake on the floor. The sheets, hopelessly rumpled, screaming of two bodies, not one. The bathroom, she mouthed, her voice stolen by terror. As Liam grabbed his belt and shoes, she swept the glasses onto a single tray, her hands shaking so badly that they clinked together. She heard the front door close. Footsteps in the marble foyer. Richard was calling her name. "Isabella? You up?" His voice, usually a source of irritation, now sounded like the voice of doom. Liam, now fully dressed, gave her one last, wild-eyed look. He pressed a finger to his lips, a silent command for her to be calm, before slipping into the cavernous ensuite bathroom and pulling the heavy door almost completely shut, leaving only a sliver of a gap. Isabella's heart was a wild bird trapped in her chest. She had seconds. She ripped the sheets from the bed in a single, violent pull, bundling the evidence of their shared warmth into a ball and throwing it into a laundry hamper in her walk-in closet. She grabbed a fresh set of sheets, her fingers fumbling with the smooth, cool cotton, trying to remake the bed, to erase the indentation of his body next to hers. Richard's footsteps were closer now, just outside the bedroom door. She wasn't going to make it. Abandoning the bed, she dove under the covers of the half-made mattress, pulling the duvet up to her chin, forcing her breathing to slow, her eyes to close, feigning sleep. The bedroom door opened. "There you are, Richard said, his voice filling the space. Fell asleep already? She could feel his presence by the bed, could smell the faint scent of airplane air in his cologne. She forced herself to stir, to blink her eyes open with a convincing, sleepy confusion. "Richard," she murmured, her voice a dry croak. "What are you doing here? I thought you weren't back until tomorrow." He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping with his weight, sending a fresh jolt of terror through her. Liam was a dozen feet away, silent as a ghost behind a door. "Closed the deal early," Richard said, already unbuttoning his shirt. "Decided to catch the red-eye. God, I'm exhausted." He looked around the room. "What happened to the bed? Looks like a tornado went through here." Isabella's blood ran cold. "I couldn't sleep," she said, the lie coming surprisingly easily. "I was tossing and turning. I must have kicked the sheets off. It sounded plausible. Weak, but plausible." He seemed to accept it, too preoccupied with his own fatigue to question it. He gestured towards the bathroom. "I'm going to take a quick shower. Number." The word screamed in her mind. A silent, hysterical shriek. She had to stop him. "Darling, wait," she said, sitting up, forcing a seductive smile. "You just got home. Come here first." She reached for him, her hand touching his arm, praying her touch didn't betray the frantic tremor running through her entire body. For a horrible moment, she thought he would refuse. But he looked at her, a flicker of interest in his eyes. He leaned in for a kiss, his lips tasting of stale coffee. It took every ounce of her willpower not to recoil. The rest of the night was a waking nightmare. She had to endure her husband's presence, his touch, while the man she loved was hiding mere feet away. After Richard finally fell into a deep, snoring sleep, Isabella lay awake, rigid with fear, every nerve ending screaming. She didn't know how or when Liam slipped out. She must have drifted into a state of exhausted half-consciousness, because when dawn broke, he was gone. The next day was a blur of paranoia. Every time Richard looked at her for a second too long, her heart seized. Every question he asked felt like an interrogation. The affair, which had been their beautiful, intoxicating secret, was now poisoned. The freedom was gone, replaced by a cold, constant fear. Later that afternoon, as she was leaving for a bogus charity meeting, Liam was waiting by the elevator, his face an impenetrable mask of professionalism. Their eyes met for a single, fleeting second. The burning desire was gone. In its place was a shared, haunted look of pure terror. They had survived. But their secret world had been breached, and they both knew that the foundation of their beautiful, impossible love was now built on nothing but fragile, cracking ice. The terror of the close call lingered for weeks, a poison that tainted every stolen glance, every secret touch. For a time, they tried to pull back. They were meticulously professional, their interactions brief and sterile, the wall between them rebuilt with bricks of fear and caution. But the bond they had forged was too strong to be broken by fear alone. The shared trauma, the memory of their frantic, silent panic, had only bound them closer. The danger, instead of severing their connection, had cauterized it, making their stolen moments more precious, more vital. The risk was no longer a thrilling spice. It was the very air they breathed, and it made the act of loving each other a desperate, defiant necessity. They couldn't go back. Their only choice was to go deeper. They began to meet away from the penthouse, away from the all-seeing eyes of Richard's world. Liam, using his skills for their own purpose, found them a small, anonymous room in a nondescript hotel in a quiet part of Brooklyn. It was a shabby, impersonal space, with a lumpy bed and a view of a brick wall, but to them, it was paradise. It was the only place on earth that was truly theirs. It was here, in the safety of these 4 rented walls, that they allowed themselves to build a fantasy, a fragile, beautiful illusion of a future. It started one rainy afternoon, as they lay in bed, watching the water trace crooked paths down the dirty window pane. "What if?" Isabella whispered, the words so quiet they were almost lost in the sound of the rain. What if none of it was real? Richard, the penthouse, the money. What if we had just met? In a coffee shop or a bookstore? Liam was silent for a long time, his arm tightening around her. Where would we be? He asked, his voice rough. And so they began to build. They constructed a life, piece by piece, like children building a sandcastle against the tide. It was a life of impossible simplicity. They decided on a small, weather-beaten cottage on the coast of Maine. She could smell the salt in the air, feel the cool sea breeze. He would fix boats, his hands, which she loved so much, calloused from work, not from combat. She would own a small bookstore in the town, a cozy place filled with the scent of old paper and fresh coffee. They painted the picture with desperate, loving detail. Their mornings would begin with the sound of gulls, not sirens. They would wake up tangled in mismatched sheets, not in a bed the size of a small country. He would bring her coffee in a chipped ceramic mug, and they would drink it on the porch, watching the tide come in. There would be no secrets, no lies, no frantic scrambling to erase evidence. Their life would be small, but it would be whole. It would be real. "I'd read every book in your store," he murmured into her hair. "And I'd critique every single one." She laughed, a real, unburdened sound. "And I would sail with you," she replied, "even though the ocean terrifies me." The fantasy was so vivid, so detailed, that for a few hours, it felt more real than the life waiting for her back in Manhattan. It was their gospel, their prayer, a shared dream they could cling to in the dark. This desperate, beautiful dream bled into their lovemaking. The conversation about their imagined life had stoked a fire within them, a need not just to desire each other, but to possess the life they had just invented. When he kissed her, it was with a fierce, desperate passion, as if he could taste the salt of the Maine air on her lips. When she arched against him, it was not just a response to pleasure, but an attempt to ground herself in the reality of him, the only true thing in her life. This was not just sex, it was an act of alchemy. They were trying to transmute their fantasy into flesh and blood. His thrusts were deep and powerful, a frantic attempt to drive the lie of their real lives away, to stake a claim on this new truth. "Tell me about the house," he growled, his lips against her ear as he moved inside her. The color of the front door. "Blue," she gasped, her mind filled with the image, a bright, defiant blue. Her body responded with an intensity that bordered on pain. She was slick with a desperate wetness, her body shamelessly, eagerly open to him. This was the physical manifestation of her yearning, her body weeping for the life it could not have. And when he brought her to the edge, she cried out, her voice a raw, ragged sound that echoed in the small room. It was a cry that held everything within it, the exquisite pleasure of his touch, the profound love she felt for him, and the sharp, shattering pain of their hopeless situation. It was the sound of a heart breaking and soaring all at the same time. He followed her soon after, collapsing on top of her with a final, shuddering groan, burying his face in her neck, as if he could hide from the world. They lay in the afterglow, their bodies damp and trembling, the silence of the room settling around them once more. For a few perfect, suspended moments, the illusion held. They were just two lovers in a small room in Maine, the rain pattering against the roof of their cottage. But then, a sound from the real world intruded, sharp and unforgiving. The buzz of Isabella's phone on the nightstand. A text message. She didn't have to look to know who it was from. The screen lit up with Richard's name. "Landing in an hour. Have the car ready." The words were a bucket of ice water dousing the warm embers of their fantasy. The illusion shattered instantly, the fragile pieces tinkling to the floor. The shabby hotel room was no longer a paradise. It was just a shabby hotel room. He was not a boat builder. He was a bodyguard who had to get back to his post. And she was not a bookstore owner. She was the wife of the man who was landing in an hour. Liam rolled off her, the space between them suddenly feeling cold. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was heavy with the weight of their impossible reality. He began to dress, the quiet efficiency of his movements, a painful reminder of the role he had to play. They looked at each other, and the beautiful, shared dream was gone from their eyes, replaced once again by the haunted, hunted look of two people trapped in a cage, now more aware than ever of just how strong the bars truly were. The beautiful, fragile illusion they had built in that shabby hotel room did not survive the harsh light of reality. It shattered, and its pieces became tiny, sharp shards of glass embedded in their affair, causing pain with every movement, every thought. The dream of the seaside cottage, once a shared, sacred refuge, was now a source of exquisite torture. Every interaction with Richard, every moment Isabella spent living her life as the CEO's wife, was a stark, brutal reminder of the blue door she would never open, the salt air she would never breathe as Liam's partner. The fantasy had given them a glimpse of heaven, and in doing so had made their gilded cage an even more unbearable hell. The cracks began to appear, not as dramatic fissures, but as fine, hairline fractures that spread silently, threatening the entire foundation of their love. The first crack appeared as an argument, a quiet, venomous thing born of desperation. They were in the hotel room again, but the magic was gone. The space felt cheap and sordid. Isabella, fresh from a tense charity board meeting where Richard had publicly corrected her, was pacing the threadbare carpet like a trapped animal. "We could just go," she said, the words bursting out of her, a child's wish disguised as a plan. "We could just disappear. I have money, my own accounts. We could go to Argentina, or somewhere in Asia. We could start over." She looked at him, her eyes wide with a desperate, naive hope. Liam, who had been watching her with a heavy sadness, finally broke. A bitter, humorless smile touched his lips. "With your money?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. The question hung in the air between them, ugly and sharp. "And what would I be, Isabella? Your paid companion? The ex-bodyguard you take on vacation? We wouldn't be a boat builder and a bookstore owner. We would be a billionaire's runaway wife and her gigolo. That's the reality." The words, his and gigolo, struck her like a physical blow. She recoiled, wounded. "That's not what I meant," she whispered. "I know," he said, his voice laced with a frustration and self-loathing that terrified her. "But that's what it would be. You don't understand. Your money, this world. It's not a tool you can just use. It's a part of you. It's the cage, and you want me to live in it with you, just in a different location. I have nothing, Isabella. Nothing but my pride. And I'm losing that every time I sneak in here with you." The argument ended with no resolution, leaving a raw, open wound between them. The chasm of their social and financial inequality, something they had ignored in the heat of their passion, was now a vast, uncrossable canyon. His resentment, born of his own powerlessness, and her guilt, born of her unearned privilege, began to poison the very air they breathed. This new, painful awareness seeped into their physical relationship, changing its nature entirely. The slow, tender explorations and the joyful, adventurous lust were gone. In their place was a frantic, almost violent desperation. Their lovemaking became a way to silence the arguments, a way to forget the hopelessness that was closing in on them. The sex was now a collision, a way of clinging to each other as they felt the ground crumbling beneath their feet. It was rougher, faster, less about mutual pleasure and more about a desperate physical reassurance that they were still there, that this thing between them hadn't died yet. He would take her with a grim, focused intensity, his touch almost bruising, as if trying to physically brand her, to make her his in the only way he could. She would meet his roughness with her own brand of desperation, her nails scratching his back, her hips moving with a frantic rhythm, trying to achieve a release that was powerful enough to blot out the encroaching reality, but the release when it came was fleeting and offered no peace. It was just a momentary reprieve, and in the quiet afterglow, the silence was no longer comfortable. It was filled with the ghosts of their angry words, with the heavy weight of their impossible future. They were clinging to the wreckage, and the very act of clinging was breaking the thing they were trying to save. The final, definitive crack came not from within their relationship, but from the outside world, from Richard himself. He arrived home one evening in a foul mood. Over a tense dinner, he recounted his day with casual brutality. A senior executive in his company, a man who had been with him for over 20 years, had been fired. His crime? He had questioned one of Richard's decisions in a meeting with an external partner. "It was a matter of loyalty," Richard said, swirling the wine in his glass, his eyes cold. "You cannot have weakness in the ranks. You cut it out, swiftly and without sentiment. He has a wife, kids in college. Not my problem." He should have thought of that before he decided to question my judgment. He took a sip of wine, oblivious to the fact that Isabella's blood had run cold, that her hand was trembling as she placed her fork down. She chanced to look at Liam, who stood at his post by the door. His face was a mask of stone, but she could see it, a flicker of something in his eyes. He had heard, and in that moment, they both understood the terrifying, unspoken truth. The fantasy of just leaving was a pathetic, childish dream. Richard was not just a neglectful husband. He was a ruthless emperor who ruled his world with absolute power and zero sentiment. He would never, ever let his best acquisition simply walk away. The consequences would not just be a messy divorce. It would be a systematic, merciless destruction. He would ruin her, and he would annihilate Liam, a man he viewed as little more than a piece of furniture, for the sheer unforgivable audacity of it. The fight for love was not a fight they could win. They were not two lovers struggling against circumstance. They were two foot soldiers standing in the path of a tank, about to be ground into dust. The affair was no longer a dangerous thrill. It was a death sentence. There was no dramatic end. Their affair, born in a flash of desperate passion, did not die in a similar blaze of glory. It simply withered, starved of hope, and poisoned by fear. The chilling realization of Richard's ruthlessness had been a bucket of cold water on the last dying embers of their fantasy. The risk was no longer a thrill. It was a tangible, heavy presence in the room, a third party in their relationship that consumed all the air. The secret trips to the shabby hotel in Brooklyn ceased. A whispered "I can't" over the phone, a canceled meeting, a shake of the head in a quiet hallway, these were the small, silent surrenders that marked the end. The love, the all-consuming passion, was still there, a painful ache in the center of both their chests, but it was now encased in a thick, impenetrable layer of reality. They had flown too close to the sun, and the fall back to earth had broken them. Richard never confronted her. He was too arrogant, perhaps, to ever imagine his wife would seek comfort elsewhere. Or maybe he simply didn't care enough to investigate the subtle shift he must have sensed in her. Instead, he reasserted his control in his own quiet, corporate way. One morning, Isabella awoke to find a new man, a stranger with a blank face, standing at the post Liam always occupied. There was no warning. Richard mentioned it casually over breakfast, his eyes on his tablet. "I've restructured the security detail," he announced. "A new firm, more comprehensive. Liam has been reassigned. Don't worry, you're in good hands." It was a simple administrative statement, delivered with the same emotional detachment as a quarterly earnings report. But Isabella heard the unspoken message: "I own this world. I own you. Every person, every object in your life is here at my discretion." He hadn't fired Liam. He had simply deleted him from her life with a quiet, effortless flick of his power, a chilling demonstration that their epic, life-altering love affair was, to him, a personnel issue that had now been resolved. Months bled into a year. Isabella resumed her role as the perfect wife with a hollow, flawless precision. She smiled at the galas, hosted the dinner parties, and wore the diamonds. She was once again the beautiful object in the gilded cage. But something inside her was irrevocably altered. She was like a house that looks pristine from the outside, but whose foundations have been fractured beyond repair. The loneliness she felt now was a different, sharper kind. Before Liam, it had been the passive loneliness of neglect. Now, it was the active, aching loneliness of loss. She was haunted by the ghost of a life she had almost lived, by the memory of a man who had truly seen her. The final, gut-wrenching coda came at the annual winter benefit for the city library. She was draped in emeralds and silk, a perfect accessory on Richard's arm as he schmoozed with the city's elite. The ballroom was a dizzying kaleidoscope of crystal chandeliers, champagne, and forced laughter. And then, across the crowded, glittering room, she saw him. He was standing by the elbow of another man, a tech billionaire with a cruel mouth. Liam was back in the uniform, the dark suit, the earpiece. His face was the same impassive, professional mask it had been on the very first day she met him. He was a statue, a shadow, a protector. He was doing for another woman, what he had once done for her. For a horrifying moment, she wondered if he was sleeping with her too. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up. Their eyes met across the sea of oblivious faces. The roar of the party seemed to fade into a dull hum. In that one long suspended moment, an entire unspoken novel was exchanged between them. There was no anger, no blame, no longing. All of that had been burned away, leaving only the stark, desolate truth of their story. His eyes held a deep, bottomless sadness, a resigned acknowledgement of their shared fate. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a final, silent answer to the question she hadn't even realized she was asking. It was impossible. It was always impossible. Then, the moment was over. His gaze broke away, sweeping the room with professional vigilance, and he was once again just a bodyguard, a stranger. Isabella turned back to her husband, a polite smile fixed on her lips, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She stood in the dazzling light, surrounded by immense wealth, utterly and completely alone. She would live out the rest of her days in this beautiful prison, her silence and compliance, the price of her survival. Was it worth it? The stolen moments, the brief, brilliant illusion of freedom, was it worth this quiet, unending ache that would now be her constant companion? She didn't know. All she knew was that even now, standing here, draped in jewels, she could still feel the ghost of his touch on her skin, the memory of his hands, the strength in them, the tenderness. It was a phantom sensation, an eternal touch that no amount of time or distance could ever erase. It would not comfort her. It would not save her. It would simply be there, forever, a silent, burning testament to the one time in her life she had been truly, devastatingly alive.